According to FAO, currently 38% of the population in the region suffers from food insecurity, 7% faces hunger, and 24% can't afford a healthy diet. With that background in mind, today we have the pleasure of hosting Puri, Associate Vice President of the Strategy and Knowledge Department of IFAD, International Fund for Agriculture Development. She will share with us innovations in measurement and monetization of resilience that can have potential to mobilize financing for smallholder farming in the region and other parts of the world with the purpose of reducing food insecurity and improving nutritional security. Afterwards, María Ibáñez, whom most of you know, Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the Inter-American Development Bank, will engage in a conversation with Joe to further explore and dive into these topics. And lastly, we'll open the room for questions for all of you to intervene and to the Zoom room. Keep reminding me of the Zoom. Without further ado, thanks a lot, Joe, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you so much, Ana Maria, for having me here, and thank you everyone for being here. Sorry, could you go back to the first slide, please? Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. I'm Joe, and I'm coming from the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and it's a tremendous pleasure for me to be talking about this with all of you. What I do want to talk about are something called resilience credits. And the initial idea behind this was recognizing that we know that we don't have a lot of money coming into adaptation and into resilience overall, whether you look at new climate finance, whether you look at other indicators of where finance flows are going. We don't see a lot of that coming into adaptation. And where IFAD is concerned, and Pedro referred to this already, because we look at smallholder farmers, this becomes really critical for us to try and see and try and address. So the genesis of this idea actually took place when I was still working at the Green Climate Fund before I joined IFAD. And since then, it's sort of taken, it's had a little bit of traction, and we can talk about that hopefully during the discussion as well. So I'm going to go through the first more generic slides because I know that all of you know the space actually better than I do, but I do want to position the overall idea of resilience credits within the overall debate, right? So we know that climate change will impact productivity. We also know that, for example, as a consequence of the changing climate patterns, we are going to see increases in the overall production of wheat, but the pattern of production will change. So it will move to the temperates. We know that, for example, for maize, actually overall production will reduce. So what that means essentially is that we've got to start to think about changing our production patterns. But we've also got to think about the people who produce food. 1/3 of the overall food that is produced globally comes from smallholder farmers. So really addressing as to how we can create an incentive system where they are incentivized to both produce, but also take care of the fact that actually when you look at the evidence, they are far more likely to be investing in things that we truly treasure. Nature-based solutions, agroecology, agroforestry, agrobiodiversity, regenerative agriculture. Smallholder farmers, or farmers that are cultivating plots of land less than 5 to 10 hectares, are far more likely to be investing in these sorts of techniques than monoplantations or plots of land that are cultivated that are more than 10 hectares or 50 hectares, right? So really to take advantage of that. We know that also the other challenge is that food systems contribute to 1/3 of the overall greenhouse gas emissions. And like I said, 1/3 of the overall food that we consume today comes from smallholder farmers. But they are also the ones that are most affected by climate change and climate variability. Adaptation financing in this context is seeing a perilous downturn if you look at the percentage, but has essentially plateaued out if you look at the overall amount. So when I was at COP28, one of the key things that we also noted was that although there was a lot of rhetoric on adaptation, we didn't see any actually new commitments, and even on loss and damage, it was pretty anemic in terms of the amount of actual money that was getting put into loss and damage, right? So the adaptation finance gap, and I also sit in the UNEP gap report. I'm privileged to be one of the experts and also in the steering committee. We know that the adaptation gap finance gap today is anything between $200 billion and $360 billion that per year, right? And these are 10 to 18 times of what we actually require. So what we actually require and what's actually coming in, order of magnitude different. Within, and now again, focusing and keeping my focus really on food systems, two other things that I want you to notice in this chart. First, I said already, food systems account for approximately 1/3 of the overall emissions, right? But within those food systems, beef, dairy, rice account for 80% of the overall emissions. That's the first fact. The second one is that if you break down the overall emissions from food, yeah, and then you break that down, you essentially have most of it coming from livestock and from crop production. And then land use, land cover change is a large part of that. So just also making sure that we know where some of the patterns of emissions are coming from. This is the other chart that I find hugely telling. Many of you will have seen it. But the key thing that really you want to see here is that of the $653 billion, that's the big number, of new and additional climate finance, $49 billion went to adaptation in 2019-2020. 49 out of the 653. Most of it went to mitigation, right? So clearly the skew is huge. And what we've got to do is try and see as to how we can create incentives within the system to change that. The other parts of this are even more exciting, but we won't go into this. Most of the mitigation financing is coming from commercial, financial institutions, and corporations. Most of the adaptation funding is coming from public finance institutions, national DFIs, bilateral DFIs, government, etc. But public financing is clearly important for adaptation, even though it's very small. And then most of the mitigation is coming from commercial sources. Okay, so really what we need is to think about how we can transition towards our food and nutrition goals with new capital formation and reallocating existing capital at new speed and new scale, right? So that's sort of my key takeaway from all of these big financial flows that we are witnessing. Within this, one more sort of rant from my side before we go into resilience credit is that MDBs and IFIs are not doing their job adequately. Yeah, and of course, IFAD is an IFI, so I'm representing IFAD as well, and we're really trying to change that. But clearly, in the context of the MDB evolution debate, this is something that we've really got to consider. The fact that if you look in 2021, the overall excuse me, the overall requirement was approximately 6.6 billion, but what was really coming from MDBs was extremely small, and the gap in terms of what MDBs are mobilizing from private sector is even smaller. Yeah, so that becomes really one of the other clarion calls that we've got to pay heed to, and clearly IDB is also thinking about this. I think the important thing is also recognizing. So some of the investments that we do, that IFAD does, is on value chains, right? So now just focusing on where we are looking. So we work in more than 80 countries, in developing countries, and really focus on the value chains and really ensure that, yes, many of the food systems, the seed systems, the storage systems are really being built. Our average sort of investment size from our program of loan and grants is approximately 50 million, and then we manage to leverage 1:6, right? So that becomes a really important part of what we are thinking. But some of the unintended consequences, and this is really in the interest of knowledge sharing, etc., some of the unintended consequences that we are witnessing also as a consequence of this is that although we are going into a lot of rural areas and we see ourselves as leaders in sort of rural financing, actually money is not sufficient. The quality of that money really needs a lot more focus. Because when we look at the dietary diversity of the targeted populations that we are looking at, and that's what this chart is looking at. Apologies, I should have I should have put some other highlight. But what these charts are essentially showing to you is that despite there being a huge amount of opportunity, and I'll talk about this one, actually, despite money going in, we are not able to change in a dramatic way the dietary diversity that we want to see in rural areas, even though we are putting in money. So it's the quality and not so much the quantity of resources that we really need to be thinking about a whole lot more, right? And what this chart is essentially showing is that, look, there is a potential for food systems to become net sinks. So currently, it's a net emitter, right? 1/3 of the overall emissions are coming from food. But we have, if we decided to take on a few things, if we decided to move to plant-rich diets, healthy calories, higher yields, half the waste, higher efficiency, we could actually change food systems. And this -7 is the big money number on this chart. It's essentially saying you can actually make food systems a sink. You can actually make it a sink of greenhouse gas emissions. But clearly, we need far more resources in this space for that to happen. Okay, so in this overall framework, what IFAD does is that we focus on resilience. That's our top level sort of formula for how we want to think about resilience. And so we work through different sectors, and unfortunately through all of the silos that you all recognize: nutrition, water, uh, creating new jobs, financial instruments, etc. Which then means is that what that means is, and this comes to the crux of basically what I want to talk about belatedly, is that resilience becomes a very fragmented sector. Depending on which pathway you're choosing, you basically are either a water sector intervener, or you're a food sector intervener, or you're a financial instruments or a financial access intervener. But really, it then becomes very, very sector specific. And it's no longer just looking at the ultimate outcome that we all care about, which is resilience. So that's essentially then what we started to think about, that look, this is fragmenting the market for resilience. Anyone who wants to come in for resilience then has to go and speak to the water expert or the finance expert or to the infrastructure expert, but is not really speaking to the things that we are all interested in, which is both locally driven, because clearly the solutions have to be locally driven, but is also driven by the overall outcome, which is resilience. So in this idea, we started to think about a resilience credit, right? The idea that, yeah, there are two things that we can try and do if we want to bring in more resources. First, this thought, sorry, I'm going to try something. Okay. First, this thought that, one, if you truly wanted to bring in more, don't change the slides. If you truly wanted to bring in more financing into resilience, one, you should know how to measure it in a comprehensive way at the outcome level and not so much the activity level. And if you had a credible way of measuring it, then you could essentially use financial technology to say, look, we are changing resilience by 1%. For every 1%, this is a simplistic way of thinking about it, you have a concerned donor or an investor coming in saying, yeah, we are interested in changing or moving the needle on resilience by, say, 10%. If you change it by 10%, we are willing to put in $50 billion, right? So that's essentially this idea. Don't worry about it. I got it. I know it really, really freaks out everyone when I do that, but okay. So really, this idea that, yeah, you can essentially change. If you had a good measure of resilience on one side, you were able to be very credible about it, then you could use the technology that you've essentially used for carbon markets to then say, oh yeah, we can do this with resilience as well. And so that's essentially the idea that we had in our heads. First measure, give bragging rights, make sure, and then start to think about the investors that are truly interested in doing this, because resilience has both a private good element to it. As an investor, I want my investment to be resilient, but there is a global good benefit to it as well. Once I make the investment, say, in food and in water far more secure and resilient, then my global food supply chains become far more secure as well. They become less vulnerable. So there is a global good aspect to also investing in resilience. And those are sorts of the investors that you also want to bring into the space. Okay, now I'm going to make the word sane again. Okay, so this is the idea of essentially thinking about the resilience credit. Two-step, measure. Second, think about investors who want to come in. But clearly, the nut to crack is measurement. I'll skip this part and come back to it. So the idea was this, to really see as to how we could establish what is the consequence of a resilience dividend, right? Very much like a peace dividend, over and above what would have happened in the counterfactual area, try and see as to what is creating, what is helping communities to respond and adapt better compared to what would have happened in the counterfactual areas, right? And this could be, either you're extending the duration of resistance, reducing the duration of disruption, or reducing the duration of recovery. And we can parse this in discussion, but I don't need you to look at the details right now. Then we looked at our own portfolio. And we looked at our portfolio, and this is our program of work of approximately $8 billion. And we said, okay, can we start to use this measurement as part of, so we, just as an aside, we also do impact assessments. We do impact assessments on 15% of our portfolio that is representative of the portfolio, and they are, it's randomly selected, our investments, and we do impact assessments on those. With the idea of accountability, we report to our board, and we essentially say, this is what is happening in our portfolio, and we essentially extrapolate the results from our sample to our overall portfolio. If I'm going too fast, please tell me. Anyone? Am I going too fast? Okay. So in that, we then started to think about, okay, how can we measure the overall shock exposure for the households that we are working with? So this is, for those of you who know counterfactual measurement, we are looking at the intent to treat. So not just the treatment of the treated. That is, we are not just looking at those that we are actually going to. We are looking at the intent to treat. We are saying, okay, did you suffer a shock? That's a dummy variable 0, 1. And if yes, what was the severity, right? So that for the household that has been affected, that is your essentially your shock exposure. We created an entire typology of more than 23 such shocks. Now the important thing, there is another important thing, and we measure this both at the level of the household, and we measure this at the level of the community as well. So communities, right? So we work across, and this is approximately, the sample is approximately $1.1 billion of our investments, and that's where we are measuring with our measurement survey protocols, right? And we create this index of ability. No, we do the same thing in our counterfactual areas. So those counterfactual areas are also then identified right at the beginning. There's matching that takes place on 36 variables, and I can talk about that if you're interested. But the counterfactual, the idea of the counterfactual is very much similar for those of you who know carbon and who know RED+. Then using those MRV systems is essentially what you're doing with RED+. And we essentially said, oh, we can do that for resilience as well. Yeah, and then the difference, so it's essentially the double difference between those areas is giving us the change in the average ability to respond, which is what we are essentially computing for the areas that we are targeting. For those of you who don't care about counterfactuals, none of this is important. All it is important to recognize is that this is shock agnostic, because we are looking at all of the shocks, and because we are looking at counterfactual areas as well. You can be in a chronic shock situation. So you can be, for example, in DRC. There is a chronic shock situation which has been going on for 20 years. All you want to do is measure the ability of the populations where we are coming in with the investment to see whether their ability to recover and respond is different from those that is there in essentially counterfactual areas, right? And so that's what we measure in the ability to recover and respond. Again, for those of you who are not interested in this, but I know Maria might be, so I actually did this slide for her. This is 24 sites. They are representative of our population. This is the sample. So each line actually represents one single investment area, right? And what this is a forest plot. So this is the line of unity. If my average effect size, which are these small diamonds, lie to the left of my line of unity, it essentially means my project failed, because your odds ratio is less than 1. That is, the likelihood of success versus the likelihood of failure is less than 1. If my diamond is to the right of line of unity, then we essentially say that, yes, the likelihood of success is high, and we call it a success. This is a portfolio approach, right? You'll see that actually there are some projects where our average effect, the effect that IFAD investments are making compared to the counterfactual areas, is lesser than what would have happened in the counterfactual areas. We're ashamed of those, but we also learned. But there are many others where we actually learned, where we did quite well. And then this diamond at the bottom is our overall average effect size, right? For the entire portfolio, for the entire sample, what we are saying is that if you pulled all of this data, re-estimated the average treatment effect, that's essentially what we are getting, which is a 14% improvement on what would have happened in the counterfactual areas with respect to resilience, right? So this is a meta-analysis. And so this is essentially then underlying the idea of a resilience credit market or a financing instrument. What happens? Do I have 2 more minutes? Can I go? Okay. So what happens in a regular space that we are working in? We work with intermediaries or local banks. Sorry for the very bad abbreviation, but the SHF stands for smallholder farmer. We're basically saying that, look, we know that smallholder farmers are far more likely to make resilience-related investments, but they need capital. Most areas where we work in, those markets are missing, right? Labor markets are missing, financial markets are missing, etc. So you need to be able to both provide incentive to the intermediaries or to the local banks and provide them to the smallholder farmer, which of course we do, right? But the key thing is, how can we create then incentives for an investor to come in to also then invest in that space, right? So this is the resilience credit investor who then comes in with 2 ideas in mind. First, they want to see improved resilience on the ground, but be able to measure it and therefore get bragging rights. And second, they also want to be able to say that, yes, they were able to make that improvement in resilience and be able to trade it possibly with those that are interested in resilience, just don't have the opportunity, right? And this is what is happening in a lot of low-income economies that we are working in, where there are low-hanging fruit in terms of resilience improvement opportunities. It's just that they are very geographically specific. And unlike many other things, many other goods that you can trade, you can't trade that opportunity. So the resilience credit idea essentially creates that market, that you can trade this or you can sell it to others who are similarly interested in resilience. Excuse me. But the idea is clearly, you've got to then go into the domain of blended finance to then see as to how we can bring together different investors with different financing appetites and different risk appetites. So essentially then what we do is, oh, sorry, I'm not going to show you this. Then essentially what we do is creating, and there is a far more complicated version of this financing mechanism, is to create a financing mechanism where you can sell the resilience credit, and currently we are in the willingness to pay part of that overall resilience credit, create that intermediary fund where part of it is funded because of the sales of resilience credit, part of it is IFAD then also ensuring that it comes in as a first loss taker or even as a second loss taker, but we're also speaking to foundations who are interested in seeing that and being part of the first loss taker and or being second loss takers. But the RC investor essentially comes in for the senior debt, for the senior tranche, right? To essentially say that, look, we are interested, but clearly we'd like our payback within whatever period of time with whatever interest. And given that you're investing in resilience, then that's helping to secure a large part of their investment on the ground as well. So there are four actors clearly in this overall space. There's the farmer, there's the resilience credit investor, there's the aggregator and or the IFI, the financial institution who is essentially acting as the typical financial intermediary, and there's IFAD or an international organization that is acting as the market maker and is essentially the partial risk underwriter, in this space. And the aggregator, the financial intermediary, is essentially purchasing the resilience credit from the smallholder farmer and or selling it. So overall, I'm going to try and close here, and hopefully we can have a discussion about this. We're recognizing that smallholder agricultural systems will be most affected by productivity declines. Resilience credits are our way of really thinking through how we can create the incentives for both smallholder farmers, but also off-takers, as well as investors that are truly interested in resilience, while being pathway agnostic. So it doesn't matter whether you go through water, infrastructure, food, etc. What you're really doing is, all we want is resilience, right? Clearly in this, the measurement and establishing the additionality is really, really important. But what we are saying is that it is possible to do that. What I was showing in an initial chart that I very, very quickly glossed over was this, that we were able to establish this for our $8.5 billion portfolio versus counterfactuals. So you can take a portfolio approach in this, and you don't have to go sector by sector. And last, really, this is something that I'm personally very invested in seeing that we can't afford to keep impact washing. We've seen this in the ESG space, in the green space, etc. And that's why the measurement part is really important for me. And I do think that it is important for us to also, as international financing organizations, really put our money where our mouths are. Thank you.
Don't go.
No.
Thanks very much, Joe. Very interesting presentation. So now I invite you to just have that conversation. We'll keep an eye on the watch or the clock. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Pedro, and thank you, Jyotsna, very much for being here. Jyotsna and I studied together in our PhD. It was a while back, but since then, Jyotsna was working on climate change. So Jyotsna is a person that has been working on this issue for a very long time and think about it in several dimensions. So I'm happy to have you here, Jyotsna. When we see what's happening here at the IDB and at the world, we are working, and the IDB has been working intensively on mitigation. And we think mitigation is really important. But something that for us is important as well is that we are now moving also to adaptation. We believe that the focus of the IDB on mitigation has been quite strong, and that now we need to move also to adaptation. And that's part of what you presented, no? When we have that the climate finance worldwide is allocated mostly for mitigation activities, such as reforestation and forest protection, this is 90% and only 10% for adaptation. This is also happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. It has happened also with the Inter-American Development Bank. So we are quite aware that we need to move from mitigation to adaptation. We need to do both things. And when we look at the mitigation activities within the bank and within the region, climate finance really has been concentrated on 4 countries: Mexico, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Colombia. And we don't have enough support, financial support for adaptation. And we do believe that this can be a recipe for failure because mitigation and adaptation go hand in hand. if you look at small farmers, if small farmers, if we don't do adaptation activities, if we don't help adaptation farmers to adapt to climate change, they might do more deforestation to expand the agricultural frontier, to expand production. They might use more chemical inputs and pesticides. So that is going to have this vicious cycle between low mitigation, low adaptation, that we don't want to do that. Here at the bank, acknowledging this, in the new institutional strategy, we are trying to rebalance the efforts that we're doing. So we have 3 objectives in the new institutional strategy that we are going to discuss in República Dominicana next week. And the 3 objectives, one of them is climate change. But in this case, we're talking about climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, which is very important. And this is going to guide our actions for the next 7 years. So given all this very long introduction of what I'm saying is, do you think, Jyotsna, what I was saying, that lack of investment on adaptation could also harm mitigation efforts?
Thanks so much, Ana Maria. So I should say, yes, we went to graduate school together, and Ana Maria was a rock star even then. Yeah, really happy to be doing this discussion with her. I think one of the key things that we recognize is, so let me just put out a number for you, right? If you invest in adaptation and or resilience now, you prevent $7 of humanitarian, for every $1 invested now, you prevent $7 of humanitarian and emergency funding in the future. That by itself sort of gives you a pretty good idea of what it means to essentially, doing preventative work versus doing curative work, right? And in a lot of the mitigation investments, and we just came from a discussion that we were having with a climate and security outfit, in a lot of the investments that we are doing, and a lot of the mitigation investments I know that the bank does are large infrastructure and large investments. Unless we spend on adaptation now, a lot of those investments are going to be imperiled, right? So what we are really thinking about is, unless you spend now, you're essentially going to, this is the classic sort of high discount factors that we all witness in the climate world. So unless you spend on adaptation, and there are lots of opportunities for big adaptation related investments. So for example, in Egypt, we're working with EBRD and a few others for a $9 billion overall investment on WAFI, which is at the nexus of energy, water, and food. And we are leading on the food pillar. And our overall investment will come to more than $2 billion. So there are lots of opportunities for adaptation funding, and it becomes even more important for us to consider it if you realize that mitigation investments today will be imperiled unless we do a lot more adaptation work.
And I would add, Jyotsna, to that we talk a lot about, when we talk about mitigation, we talk about like a point of no return if we don't reduce the greenhouse emissions. But there is also a point of no return with adaptation, no? Absolutely. So if we don't do adaptation activities in certain areas, those areas might become unfeasible for agricultural production, for example.
Absolutely. And so 2 things. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, the news article on, how we are now past 1.5 degrees. It means that clearly there's a tipping point. One of the many tipping points has been reached. We've exceeded planetary boundaries with respect to several of the 4 out of 9 planetary boundaries have been exceeded. But overall, I think what we've got to witness is this idea of point of no return that you mentioned, Ana Maria. That's why the Loss and Damage Fund was essentially put together, realizing that actually there are unavoidable losses that we are essentially going to witness because we just did not invest in adaptation or mitigation in time. And those unavoidable losses is essentially the word, are essentially the loss and damage. It's the other word for loss and damage. They can be economic, although they can be non-economic. And again, for the loss and damage fund, the key thing will be figuring out as to how we allocate, how we provide, how we rank those opportunities. But the point of no return has already been crossed, and which is why I think that the loss and damage fund did get the attention that it needed to.
Jyotsna, you mentioned that for the resilience credits to be feasible, we need to do a mechanism that to monitor and measure resilience. You are an expert on this, Jyotsna. You have been working on impact evaluation for many years. You know also very extensively how to work on monitor and to measure resilience. And what the mechanism that you are proposing is similar to what when we talk about the carbon sequestration credits that are important as well. And one of the many challenges of the carbon sequestration credits was the monitoring and measurement. So in the case of resilience credits, you showed the example of IFAD, but you had all the ability in IFAD to do what you did, to do what you showed to us. How can we help governments to create those capacities, to create the capacities to monitor, to show the resilience credits that you are proposing to create?
Great question. So if I might, I'm going to take you back. So today is 2024, so 96 years, which is the Great Depression. And the reason that I'm taking us all back there is actually at the end of the 1800s, and economic history is such a big teller of lessons. At the end of the 1800s, they had already started a clarion call for doing standardized reporting on what is, the double entry accounting that we all are aware of now, right? So knowing the health of firms and enterprises, having a standardized way of understanding assets and liabilities and doing double data entry, was that a clarion call had already started in the late 1800s. Guess what was the big obstacle as to why companies, firms, and enterprises did not take it on? It was too expensive. Then the Great Depression occurred. The Great Depression essentially taught us that we did not know how to assess the health of firms. And very quickly, the world changed, and we now have chartered accountants who are part of our fabric of, of financial health, of financial due diligence that we have to do for every organization worth its salt, right? So I think this is a telling moment for us. We are, whether we like it or not, I think we are at that moment again. Yes, you can keep saying that it's expensive to do it, but actually with satellite technology, we can measure and we can verify far more easily today in terms of whether we were additional or not, whether we were credible, whether we actually created that impact, whether the impact washing occurred or not, than frankly in the 1930s. So the amount of investment that you are required to put into measuring credibly is far lesser as an order of magnitude than what was required today. What we need to create is a cadre of, investors who are really interested in this. Public financial institutions have a moral responsibility, if not an ethical one, to really push for it, because we need to be ahead of the curve and asking the private sector to do it. And third, what we require today is also then third-party verification systems. And yeah, we have the Veras of the world and the gold standards of the world, et cetera, that look at verifying carbon credits. But the time has come, the world has said, for us to think about really looking at the impact that we're making with respect to not just resilience, but overall. And I think we need to be far more credible in how we do that. So yes, it will require an investment. And I'm not going to dollar wash it. But I think what is really important is recognizing is that if we ignore that at our own peril today.
Just that you were describing the process of the Great Depression, and I was thinking also that when seeing your presentation, that there are a lot of global market failures and local market failures involved in what you are proposing. So the role of the governments and even the international organizations is to solve those market failures in order for the market to start working. So thinking about the global market failures and the role of us, IDB, like the IDB as a multilateral development bank and you in IFAD as an international organization, I wanted to ask you, which is the role that us, for example, that the IDB should play and how we should work with countries in order to solve these market failures that are necessary to solve in order for the market to work.
Yeah. So first, I think taking the question of just resilience, the big market failure there is that you're not valuing a global good, right? You're not pricing a global good. And clearly, then an institution like the IDB, with the heft that you really command, I think it becomes really important for the IDB then to essentially say that, look, we've got to price what is an externality. That's just, economics 101. I think the second part of this is really creating that capacity within governments. One of the challenges that we face as IFAD, given most of the work that we do is lending, is actually governments don't want to borrow for climate. They want to borrow even lesser for adaptation. They don't mind borrowing for mitigation, but they want to borrow even lesser for adaptation. So I truly think that here supply creates its own demand. We have to start to shape the market. And that's where I ended with the opportunity has come for us to start to create and shape new markets. And that's what international financing institutions can do. Shape that market with governments to then say, look, you really need this. You really need to look at resilience and you need to look at adaptation. We can help to create the capacity. But that responsibility for creating a new market is ours. We have markets for things that are completely useless, iPhones, and we still buy them. I still buy diamonds, they're completely useless. If we can do that, why can't we do that for resilience, which is a global good and a private good? So I think that the IDB and IFAD can really work superbly in that space of creating a completely new market. And then I think the third part where where public financing institutions can come in, I'm clearly using that term as a overall term also for the IDB and for ourselves as well, is really in that measurement space. So clearly you need the independent, impartial broker in that space to take it forward. This is a global good. You've got to recognize, yes, we think that the private sector can play a very important role, but unless we create that space for them, nothing's going to magically happen after 30 years of asking for the private sector to come into this space that is suddenly going to change unless we create that space. So that's also our responsibility.
Just now, one question, and I would ask one last question, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions. Resilience is a very difficult term, no? It really implies that societies and farmers and producers are able to prevent, resist. I'm going to read it because it's a lot of information. Absorb, adapt, respond, and recover positively, efficiently, and effective when they are facing risks. And as you very well showed in one of the slides that you have, this involves many sectors. But this is also a process that is dynamic. It's not a static process. It doesn't happen from one day to the other. It's a process that takes a lot of time. And it's going to require the coordination of many actors, as you already mentioned. How can, so it's a process that is going to happen through time. It's going to be a dynamic process. And how can the resilience credit mechanism capture all this dynamic process such that it includes the ability of societies and countries and communities to gradually improve resilience?
Yeah, great question, Ana Maria. So I think the one thing that I like about resilience credits or monetizing this idea, and we're doing this, I should say this jointly. So we did sort of a assessment of, whether we just had a blind spot, and we asked Duke University to then collaborate to try and figure out what are possible other mechanisms that are also coming out there. So we know, for example, there's biodiversity credits, there's blue credits, etc., that are also being touted. We also looked at other measurement methods. So we're also bringing out that paper by the end of actually in the next few days. But just to say that, you're absolutely right. There are a few things that the resilience credits concept does. One, it's pathway agnostic. You mentioned that. Second, it's scale agnostic, right? So I can look at resilience both at the level of the household and see as to whether an investment has made an additional difference, on resilience at the level of the household. But one of the key things that was a challenge, that has been a challenge in other measurements of resilience, has been acknowledging that communities over and above households play a very important part, in the social networks. And you've done work in this, María. Social networks are a really important part of also what contributes to the resilience of a community and the households thereof, right? And if you only measure it at the level of the household, then you really ignore a very important part of what is also contributing to resilience, which is my networks, my social networks within the community and also outside. So the idea, because you're measuring this both at the level of the household, but also at the level of the community, and frankly at the landscape level, and we're combining this also with biophysical indicators, etc., then we can try and understand this at the landscape level. So whether it's the region, or whether it's the community, or whether it's the sub-regional level. So it is possible for us to then see as to what are the other public goods that might be contributing to resilience, and it's not just a function of your household attributes, right? So that's the second. The third part, and you alluded to that, is that, look, it's a dynamic concept, right? One question that, of course, I think is really important even in this measure is, how long are you measuring that resilience improvement over, right? And of course, in our protocols, so we said over the past year, if there had been a shock and then the ability to recover from those shocks in the past year, you could change that temporal timeline. It becomes more and more difficult. We know this from survey instruments. It becomes more and more difficult to try and see as to how the fidelity of your responses changes when you extend that timeline. But now that's why we brought in Duke as well to work with us. We also wanted to understand, well, can we look at it at this landscape level? So then if you have satellite imagery, and we have high resolution now, 1 meter resolution maps, etc., you can do this at landscape level, but over 20 years or 15 years, depends very much on the investor. What I'd like to think about it is that, look, you need one resilience measure, and we can think about what the timeline is. That doesn't matter. We can measure. But the important thing is really changing the norm within the investment community to then say, look, this is what you should care about. And now let's put together the finance platform where we are able to bring in the different risk appetites of the different investors, as well as ourselves, to then blend them together and to start to create this facility that does the initial payout, therefore demonstrate as to how this works, and also shows as to what the willingness to pay is for these kind of outcomes.
Pedro, go ahead. I have one question additional, but only when we finish, if we have time.
Well, okay, we'll give it to the floor, and don't be shy. I know you have questions. So if not, we're going to keep it with them. It's very entertaining. So from the Zoom channel.
Since everyone is shy here in the room, we're going to give the questions to the Zoom. We have around 300 people connected from all over the region, Colombia, Ecuador, saying hi. There's a question that says, for Puri, how will the private resilience investor get returns for the investment, especially in smallholder production systems? Possibly you could give an example.
Yeah. So there are two ways to think about the returns on investment. One is, of course, that you're investing in geographies where the investor himself or herself is working, right? So then you're helping to make your investment far more resilient. This is very much like it sort of is. So you're ensuring that your resilience investment has been made far more secure. But the other thing is when you trade resilience credits, that's important. And that's sort of very analogous to what's happening with the carbon credits, right? Which is then recognizing, so actually with smallholder farmers, there is the entire other challenge as to why private sector investors don't come in, which is aggregation. You don't have aggregation, you don't have scale economies. So remember that I also spoke about the off-taker. Now the RC investor, the resilience credit investor, and the off-taker could essentially be the same people. But we'll try and keep that function a little bit separate. But the other part of this is essentially saying that, look, we can sell or buy resilience credit. And once you have that revenue, clearly, the resilience investment would have occurred anyway, right? So anything that is revenue that is generated as a consequence of investing is essentially just, all of it is profit. And what you would do is take a percentage of that, put that into a resilience financing mechanism. But most of it would go to the resilience investor for taking on the risk. So this is risk adjusted. But part of it, and I'm really keen to emphasize this, part of it would also be part of a benefit sharing mechanism where the smallholder farmer would also get some revenues, because you need to incentivize them to invest in this as well. Over.
Thank you.
Another one. Oh, Juan Pablo, there. Go.
Gracias, Grace. No, thank you for the presentation. Juan Pablo Bonilla, Manager of Climate and Sustainable Development. I think what you're bringing about monetizing resiliency, I think is key. And we are developing, as Ana María said, different instruments that are more linked to mitigation. But I think we could also use those instruments to resiliency if we have the matrix. For example, the ADB has been leader in sustainability-linked bonds.
Yeah.
But basically related to mitigation.
Yeah.
Uruguay was a good example, but for the first time we included biodiversity matrix.
Yeah.
So if we're able to have a good way to measure resiliency, we could support our government to have resiliency-linked bonds.
Absolutely.
And it's an easier way for a Ministry of Finance to, based on KPIs, issue resiliency bonds, for example.
Absolutely.
It's to complement what you're doing. It's not either or, right? We're doing debt for nature swaps with policy-based guarantees. We could do resiliency swaps, right?
Exactly.
So, but the question is user risk from the MDB's point of view. We're doing all of these the debt for nature swaps based on guarantees. It's policy-based guarantees that we're pushing. But the rating agencies account a guarantee of the bank equally that alone. So we don't have the incentives to be more aggressive, more riskier, if that is not changed.
I agree.
If it invests the private sector, every time they have more vulnerability exposed, the price is higher. So we're pushing vulnerability. We're not rewarding resiliency as a system. When you take the rating agencies and others, so if you unlock that for the MDBs, we're gonna be able to move the needle. So anyways, it's not to justify that we're not doing enough. It's that we have to do it, but we also need the system to change the incentives for the MDBs to be, more aggressive.
I love that point. I love that point, but primarily also because I've been making part of it. So one of the slides I sort of glossed over was exactly talking about resilience bonds, also talking about, debt for nature swaps and sort of creating that analogy there, etc. So why not debt for resilience swaps, right? And exactly, once you crack that part of the measurement, then you can sustainability linked bonds. So we also, IFAD's coming in very tentative way, but we are coming into that space as well. But your point is absolutely right. Actually, currently guarantees, when I was looking at some of the performance on guarantees, it was really interesting for me that actually guarantees have not performed as well because there's no internal incentive within systems, within institutions to actually push out guarantees. For every $1 of guarantee you do, you've got to keep $1 on your bank. That makes absolutely no sense. So I've actually internally within IFAD, we've been talking about, guarantees and then partial credit guarantees, etc. But clearly that part of the system needs to change if you really want to. And, in the overall context of MDB evolution and balance sheet optimization, this part has to change. Because internally, there are no incentives for my portfolio managers to push out a guarantee. Punto. So, I couldn't agree more with what you said. It's a really well-made point.
And one favor, this morning we had an amazing conversation with Ana María about a project with the small farmers related to technology, agriculture, and adaptation. I think it would be great if in one of the loans that we're preparing with Pedro, if we could start understanding with your support, with your team, how to measure resilience in one of those, that would be very good.
Anytime. We would love that.
And that was actually one of the questions Ana María posed to the presenter. It's a little bit in that direction. So, Ana María, you got the floor for the last question. Monsieur.
Pedro, I had the same question as Juan Pablo, so we can allow somebody else to ask a question, because I wanted to talk about guarantees and other types of financial
Good.
mechanisms that we can use. So
We have time for
let's
one more
provide the
question.
opportunity to another person.
Yes,
Thanks.
one more from the public in watching this via live stream. What challenges are countries facing in terms of improving measurement for data generation?
That's a big question. Okay, I'm going to try this. Very high discount rates, very little capacity, perceived high cost. Those are my top 3 challenges that I think countries face. Starting last in first out. Perceived high cost. Most countries think it's superbly expensive to measure. In my earlier incarnations in life, when I've gone and sort of advised countries and organizations on, setting up measurement systems, etc., I found that people don't adequately understand the power of sampling. People think they have to measure everything. That's not true. We know that we can sample and still get very robust estimates. Let's do that. People end up spending almost all of their budgets on measuring everything. Please don't. I think the second part is really capacity. So in countries, a lot of countries just don't think that data, well, M&E, I hate using the word M&E, this is really about good measurement, doesn't have sufficient, doesn't have a home, frankly. When we work with ministries of health, and this is the political economy of measurement that I think we've got to start to now address far more unequivocally, right? Most ministries that we go to, there is no national statistical services. Actually, that's not true. In Latin America and the Caribbean, you're an outlier with respect to capacities on the ground. Kenya, India, yeah, have decent measurement capacities, not the best, but if you look at Colombia, or if you look at Brazil, or if you look at Mexico, fantastic ability to measure. But I think what we need is central authorities that are well budgeted, that have good capacities, and that have really advocacy power to really take it on. There are some examples in the region that I like. I like Mexico. I think Brazil, Colombia do decently well, but that's not true for most of the other countries. And I think the first, I can't remember what I ranked first, but I would sort of say also, there's just, oh yeah, the cost of this is actually not as high as what we think it is. So I would also say that on one side, what has really been a huge challenge for this space has been thinking that, yeah, we can go and look at activities and then say, this is our impact. Please don't do that. It leads to too much impact washing, and I get really bothered by that, both as a global citizen, but also as a responsible public sector worker. I think it's really important that we start to think about how much fake news and fake data we end up creating as a consequence. So if we've got to keep calling it out, and I do that all the time. Thanks.
With that thought, thank you very, very much, Ana María and Joe, and everyone in the room and the Zoom live stream. And with that, we invite you to, all of you, the ones, especially the ones connected via Zoom, to connect or see our YouTube channel, IDB's YouTube channel, where you can rewatch this event, share this event, or rewatch others on the Seeds for Food Security series that we have in the web. So thanks a lot again. Thank you very much. And a great applause for Joe and Ana María.